empower people to build the skills they need so that hopefully collectively we can put an end to a system that was created to suppress and destroy. Unlearn all the lies we've been fed previously. It's a big ask because, ego is not always our friend, right? Like, you have to admit to yourself that you were duped for the most part of your life before you can accept what the next steps can be like. And so this is where, the education, the messaging, the conversations need to continue to happen, and happen more aggressively, so to speak, simply because the window of time is not as luxurious as it used to be like 5 years ago.
On my channel, I often say war is coming. And the reason why I say war is coming is because many years ago, Tony, I did a degree in economics. And it's only when I got into Bitcoin, I realized how ignorant I was about money. And the reason why I say, hey, look at me, I've got a degree in economics, because it's like, if I had a formal per se qualification in macroeconomics, and I was completely ignorant to the way the world worked around me until I got into Bitcoin, then what hope did the rest of us have? But I do recall during one of my courses, during that 3-year degree, is that my professor, a man I deeply respected, he said, war is part of the macroeconomic cycle. And as a young student back then, I had no idea what that meant. As I moved further in my life, I realized that when the debt gets too much, there's only one way to get rid of it. And typically part of that economic cycle, as my professor was saying all these years ago, is the war that kicks off as part of that macroeconomic cycle. I had goosebumps when you said that explosion in Lebanon was part of what you were describing with the financial system collapsing. I hadn't made that connection. Can you help me unpack that a little bit more? So I certainly remember the explosion. We saw, how does that explosion, can you give me a little bit more details? How does that link to the collapse of the financial system?
It doesn't. It came afterwards. And then there were talks that in that port where that explosion took place, coincidentally, there were a lot of records of the corruption stored in there. And, somehow, unfortunately, because the port blew up, since they were storing volatile substances that the government knew about for a very long time and did nothing, even though they knew that this could go off at any minute now, they left it there for months. And coincidentally, there happened to be, a lot of records, supposedly. I mean, no one was able to confirm because they blew it up. But any investigation after that explosion was immediately shut down and blocked. Like, can you imagine to this day, the IMF, of all organizations, like the number one corrupt organization in the world, has not been able to make any inroads in Beirut. So if you consider them the kingpin of corruption, imagine who they're dealing with in Lebanon at the government level for them not to be able to make any headway into the country. That is who you're dealing with. All of these organizations, how are they funded? They're funded by broken money. Why? Because at a push of a button, you can create as much of it as you can. So as you mentioned earlier, or rather as your economics professor correctly pointed out, war is a business plan. It doesn't just, oops, we don't agree with them, let's go blow them up. That's how I thought it worked. When you start doing proper research, paying attention to facts, you understand that this is a business plan. First of all, what does it do? It scares the living daylights out of everyone. So it completely distracts you from where you're supposed to be focusing on, because now you're concerned about your life and what have you, which is of course a valid concern. What it also does is that it justifies unlimited money printing, but worse than that, it justifies bringing in even more excessive control and surveillance mechanisms, because now it's for your protection. If you notice, every time the system got more strict, it was usually after a horrific event, like a war, because how else are you going to get the population to willingly give up their freedom unless you scare the living daylights out of them? And this, unfortunately, to this day, a lot of people still can't comprehend that this is actually what's going on. Nothing happens just like that. When you go and you bully a nation and a country and you want to impose your values on them, even though they want nothing to do with you, and if they refuse, you blow them up, well, what do you expect the reaction to be? Especially after you've been doing it for so long. This conflict can never end as long as that bullying doesn't stop. All of these things that we're seeing around the world are like, look, in the last 2, 3 years, how many wars have we had? Like bloody hell, we're 2025 and we're still talking about nuclear wars instead of living in a world where we're progressing towards, something useful. Like, you thought the wars were behind us. No, we had the Ukraine war for 3 years, and we had the Gaza war, and now we're looking potentially at Iran wars, and then soon there'll be, who knows what they'll be. Why is the world allowing these systems to exist and continuously destroy your life? Because initially people thought, well, we have no choice. What are we going to do? Well, today you have a choice. That what can I do excuse is no longer valid. Because while we cannot go to war with these systems, obviously, nobody has an army or the will, everybody now has the option to opt out of the very system that funds that evil. When you go to work for fiat money and you save it in a bank, there's three things that nobody realizes. One, you're not working for money. You're working for worthless toilet paper that is printed out of thin air. Two, it's not even yours. Because the minute you put it in a bank, you just have access to it. It's not yours. If that bank, for whatever reason, decides they don't want to give it to you, or they don't like your face for whatever reason, there goes your money. And there's nothing you can do about this. And a lot of people are starting to see this now. Try to go to any bank and tell them, I want to withdraw X amount of money. Let me know how that goes. And it doesn't even have to be a big amount. $1,000, $2,000. 700 questions as to why you want to take it out, where you're spending it, what you're going to be doing with it, all of that garbage. How is that normal? Is that your money? Of course not. The other thing that people don't realize, when you work for that worthless paper that isn't money and you put it in a bank where it no longer is yours, then you're taxed on it. Add all these three together. You have the taxes. Then they debase the money because they keep printing that. So if you add how much purchasing power you're losing, at the end of the day, how many months of the year are you actually working for free? Depending where you are on this planet, most people are working over 6 months for absolutely nothing. Because if you're making $1,000 a month, and let's say you're paying 40% taxes on it, and it's being debased with the real inflation, not those BS numbers that the government spews out, let's say around like 10%. So let's say at best 50%. So that means 6 months out of the year, you are working, like a donkey for free, no value. So unless you're making a ton of money, where even that 50% doesn't impact, your ability to buy whatever you want, you are struggling, my friend. And most people globally are not making a crap load of money, which is why their lives are being destroyed horrifically in real time. And when it gets to a point of real pain where no one can find a reasonable answer to their problem, that's when it turns violent. Because now you have desperation that's in charge. It's no longer logic, it's emotional desperation. In the US, most Americans cannot afford a $200 or $400 emergency. Like, how is that humanly right that you have such a first world nation where over half its population cannot afford a $200 to $400 emergency? Like, first of all, what kind of emergency is going to cost you $200 to $400? Absolutely nothing. Hell, if you go to the movies, it'll probably cost you over $100 today if you're like a family of four. So what emergency can you possibly pay for $200 to $400? Nothing. So that means that everybody's broke. But you'd think, when you're in such a position, something would give. What has given? Nothing. Why? Because people remain distracted. They believe they have to vote for this person or that person or him or her because they're going to fix the problem. And that is fundamentally why nothing changes. Look, in all fairness, I used to be one of these guys who used to think you have to vote left, right, up, down, in order to fix this thing. But after you go through what I went through and you actually clear your head and focus on the truth, you understand what the game is like. You understand that there is no left or right. It's all one team. So instead of focusing on him or her, people need to look up because these are the puppet masters that are creating all of this rubbish to keep everybody distracted with everything except where they should be looking, which is the source of the problem, which is why nothing changes. I was doing a lot of reading during my Bitcoin journey, and of course came across a lot of amazing folks in the space, like Saifedean Ammous with his books, Jeff Booth, for example. One thing Jeff Booth said that's really stuck out at me, and I fully understand now, is that you cannot fix this system from within the system. Like, this has to be understood once and for all in order to move forward. It's one global system of financial oppression. They all work together. So it's not like you're going to go somewhere where you're going to escape it. The whole system needs to be dismantled. But we can't do it one by one. It needs to be done as a whole. And we also can't do it by going to war against the machine, because none of us are killers and murderers and no one has an army. So prior to 2008, we had no choice but to make the best of the situation. After 2008, after the birth of Bitcoin, that excuse is no longer valid, because now you have a real option to exit. And the way you neuter an evil empire is by rendering it irrelevant. And when enough people ignore it and no longer use it, it disappears or becomes irrelevant on its own. Not a single bullet fired. That's why they call it the peaceful revolution. But you need people to understand this. And it's a big ask. I get it. Because even for me initially, like, it took me a while to wrap my brain around it. Partially because my brain was not in the right place. But even afterwards, it still took me a long time to make sure that this wasn't, like hopium. I come from cybersecurity, my whole world. So I question absolutely everything. And I tried for many months to destroy Bitcoin, just on my own, with my own little whatever. Of course, I failed spectacularly. And then I learned that many nation states, with all their infinite resources, they also failed spectacularly. If all of these guys, with everything they have at their disposal, did nothing, what am I going to do? So that becomes a point that you put aside, you never look at anymore. Now you start focusing on, okay, how can I optimize this? How can I get more people to understand this? And this is where the journey really took off, and where my strength finally came back. My purpose was born in that moment. And so this is why, after many months of this hell, I decided to put together the Bitcoin way with the help of course, my partners who initially contacted me with that idea. That was what made me realize that my purpose here had completely changed. Like Tony 1.0, the fiat success was completely dead. And what happens when you die? You are completely free. And so what I used to believe in and think was important prior to this collapse no longer exists. My mission here now is no longer to be rich. My mission here is to empower people to build the skills they need so that hopefully collectively we can put an end to a system that was created to suppress and destroy. That is not the world I want to live in. That is not the world I want my kids to live in. That is not the world anyone should live in. We need unity in order to get to that world. If we're always going to be thinking on an individual level, what can I do for myself and myself alone? It's a lose-lose. One, you will never get far individually. And two, you're just not helping the bigger picture, which is really what matters here.
It makes perfect sense, and it's very powerful to me. And many of the references that you make to Andreas Antonopoulos in the beginning of the interview, that's where my journey started. And I can remember listening to Andreas repeatedly, all of his talks. And what's interesting about Andreas's talks, I've listened to many of his talks at the beginning of my Bitcoin journey. And then years later, I listen to the same talks again, and it's like a completely different talk because I have a completely different paradigm.